Okay, welcome back. So today I'm going to be doing a tier ranking video, and I thought it would be fun to rank all of the books that I read in school, but ranking them based on the thoughts that I had on them then, because some of these I haven't read since, and then if my thoughts have changed over time, having a little bit of a discussion about how my thoughts have changed on these books over time. We've got about 16 books in total, so let's get into it. So first we have Romeo and Juliet. This was something that I did not care for very much at all in school. I just thought it was a bit too sappy, not really for me, and you know, my thoughts on this have changed over time. I can appreciate Romeo and Juliet, and in fact someone actually told me, it might have even been another booktuber, but I can't remember exactly, but they said that they wondered if the kind of star-crossed lover thing in Romeo and Juliet is actually meant to be a parody and a joke, kind of like looking at the ridiculousness of this idea, rather than to be taken seriously. I don't know if that's the case, but it certainly is an interesting interpretation of Romeo and Juliet. But in terms of me in school, I was just a bit too edgy and depressive to appreciate this one, so not for me, unfortunately. Next we have The Fairy Tales of Oscar Wilde, and this was definitely for me in school. In fact, this was something that I stumbled upon outside of school and then decided to do one of my A-level projects on the Fairy Tales of Oscar Wilde. I think his fairy tales are just fantastic. They are kind of melancholy and sad, but also still have that childhood whimsy to them. I really enjoy The Nightingale, which I can't really spoil, it's very short, but it's just a wonderful story. They sound timeless, you know, these things could have been around for hundreds and thousands of years, which is what you want from a fairy tale, and it's amazing that Wilde was able to create that when he did with these stories. Next we have another Shakespeare, Richard III. This one I enjoyed a lot more in school. We didn't actually read the whole play. In fact, what we did was we just studied two passages. The passages where Richard convinces the respective queens. There's the one that's a widow right at the beginning, and he is able to somehow convince her to marry him, despite the fact that he killed her husband, I believe. And basically we studied the scene to kind of show how manipulative Richard is, the fact that he can do this to this woman. And then we also looked at a later scene where he tries to convince a queen to marry to let him marry her daughter, and I don't think he doesn't succeed this time. And so we compared these two scenes, and I really enjoyed that exercise. We also watched the film version of this with Ian McKellen, which is a fantastic film. The only thing I would say about Richard III is it is a little bit over the top and a little bit ridiculous, and as Shakespeare goes, it probably doesn't have the most depth, but nevertheless it's pretty good. So I'm going to put that as great novel, or in this case great play. Next we have Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Fantastic classic monster story, the first science fiction novel, many people say. Really enjoyed this one in school when I read it, and what I liked the most about Frankenstein was that it genuinely shocked me, in that, you know, with a lot of these old tales you think that you know the story because they are just so embedded in culture, but culture has really warped Frankenstein into something else. The monster is just, you know, in the media he's just this big dumb idiot that's evil, and there's nothing much to him. Whereas in the book, the monster actually has a heart and a conscience and develops as a character, and is a very sympathetic character, at least for some of the book, and it's actually quite a tragic story rather than just kind of this, you know, creature feature thing that we see in the movies. So I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed that it didn't meet my expectations in the best possible way. Also just a very well written story as well. Fantastic. If you've not read Frankenstein, you definitely should, because it's worth it. Next up we have Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. This is a book that tells a story of two friends, I want to say, not brothers, and they are labourers, and they're wandering around at the beginning of the story looking for a place to work, and they come up on this farm, and it kind of covers their time there. It's kind of a commentary on the American dream, because they have this dream together that they'll, you know, one day they'll make a lot of money and be happy, and of course it's criticising the American dream, so that doesn't happen, and something very tragic happens. I did enjoy this one, but it was one of those books that didn't stand out for me all that much in school. It was just sort of a thing that I did. Read the book because I had to read it, and it was quite short, which was quite nice. But yeah, I enjoy the ending a lot, but just didn't resonate with me all that much, and I haven't read it since, although I did buy it a couple of years afterwards, so I intended to read it again, I just didn't. So I'm going to put this in I Get Why It's a Classic, because I certainly understood why this was a good book, even if I didn't necessarily feel it myself at the time. Next up we have Animal Farm, which is another book that I chose to do for a project, because I really just wanted to read Animal Farm, because I knew of the story and just wanted to actually experience it, and I'm glad that I did, because I really enjoyed this one. I think George Orwell is probably one of my favourite writers. I've never read a bad book by him, and Animal Farm is just a wonderful, probably the best political allegory that's ever been told in my view. Just a fantastic one. I also have an affection for pigs, so I kind of like that the pig is the kind of main villain in the story as well. That's kind of fun. Next up we have, and this one might surprise some of you who are familiar with my channel, we have Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber. Now, this is a collection of gothic, very twisted, sexual fairy tales with a bit of a feminist twist. Now, if I'm going on how I feel now, this would probably be in my canon, but in school, this definitely wasn't for me. I just felt like it was too overwritten, and it didn't help that we had a teacher who was just way too into the sexual stuff and the symbolism, and she was, you know, just getting really into it, and it was kind of, everyone else was just like, okay, maybe you need to calm down and put some ice on it or something. It was too much, and so I didn't really gel with this in school. I just thought it was a bit too weird and a bit too odd to really appreciate. And you know, my thoughts on this definitely have changed over time with Carter, but in school I just didn't get it, and my teacher, she was just a bit too into it, and it was weird. So yeah, not the best one for a school education, I think. Maybe wait till you're a bit more mature for that one. In any case, next we have another gothic one, but a bit more classic, and that's Dracula. I really enjoyed Dracula in school. It was one of the books that I think I actually read more than once, rather than just reading it once and then just reading passages. I read the whole thing because I just find this story captivating. And even though I would say in school I did find it, in places it kind of gets boring, especially towards like the latter half, I really enjoyed the beginning. And still to this day I would say that those first 5 chapters with Jonathan are just some of the best gothic literature ever written. Just so tense, so atmospheric, just that slow descent as Jonathan realizes that he's trapped, and then obviously is trapped at the end. Just really good stuff. Really enjoyed this one. I don't think I would quite say I'd put it in my canon if I was going on teenage Josh rather than now, just because I do remember falling asleep a few times later on in the story. And even now I think I would probably say that Dracula could be a little bit shorter as a book. Nevertheless, it is a fantastic book, and definitely worth reading. Next we have something that was in my canon then and still is in my canon now, and that is Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things. A fantastic, tragic story of this family in India, and they break the so-called love laws, so that basically these being the laws of society that tells you who you can love and how much, and there's a breakage in these laws, and this has ramifications that destroy the family for generations to come. It's a very tragic story. It's told completely out of time, but unlike some stories where the use of telling things out of time can feel more like a gimmick, it really feels like it has purpose in this story. It makes for a much more tragic story as well, because you have these, you know, I think the story ends on a very optimistic note because it's when the characters were happy, but you've already seen previous to this where things are going to go, and they go to some very dark places, which makes the ending even more sad, even if it is a happy moment. Just a fantastic story, and probably one of the best structured stories I've ever read, which is fantastic because, you know, using that complex out of time sequence stuff, it can make for a very muddled story, but it just doesn't feel like it. It's just, everything feels like it comes together perfectly. Definitely worth reading if you haven't read this book. I can't rave about it enough. Next up we have The Great Gatsby. This is one that again I have read since, and my views on it, as is the case I think with most of these, my views have gone up. It's gone up in my estimations. But when I read this in school, I didn't connect with it all that much. Nowadays, I would say that I don't really like the critique of a book that is like, you know, I don't personally relate to characters, because I feel like, you know, you should try and relate to people that are different from you or whatever. But when I was in school, I was a lot more like that. And with this, I just couldn't relate to the characters because I thought they were all just twits. Even Gatsby, I just thought he was a bit of a knob as well. So I didn't really like the characters. I found the story a bit thin. It just kind of meanders along, and then there's the car crash, and then everyone, you know, tragedy ensues. And yeah, I didn't really connect with it, and I think partly because I didn't really appreciate what it was doing, like kind of critiquing the 1920s and that hedonistic lifestyle that people were living back then. Now I would say I'd probably put this in great novel, but in school I'm going to go with I Get Why It's a Classic, because I didn't hate it, but like Of Mice and Men, it was just one of those books that passed me by, and I was like, that was enjoyable, you know. Didn't change my world, but it was enjoyable. pleasant but not fantastic. Next we have Macbeth, which is without doubt my favourite Shakespeare play. I just love the tale of revenge, and unlike Richard III, which is a little bit too campy and over the top, Macbeth has a nice gravitas to it and a dark gothicness to it, and I just think it's great. I think the first time that I came across Macbeth was in primary school, and it was a couple, and she played Lady Macbeth and he played Macbeth, and they just did the scene where Lady Macbeth convinces Macbeth to murder Duncan, then the follow-up scene with the dagger, and then the scene, I think, also maybe the scene at the end with Lady Macbeth and the hand washing, and it just really stood out to me. Even then, just those scenes captivated me. I think I must have been like 6 as well, and I just thought, wow, this is so amazing. So yeah, fantastic play, and it's just something I've always enjoyed, and my thoughts probably are never going to change with Macbeth. I just think it's a fantastic tale of revenge, and if you've only read the play and never watched one, you should definitely watch it, because I think it just comes to life on stage as well. Fantastic. Next we have, and this is probably quite controversial, Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, and this is actually the reason why I created the made me give up literature category, because Mrs. Dalloway was the book, or one of the books, that made me give up literature in my first year of undergrad when I did philosophy and English. I dropped English and just did philosophy after first year because I just did not enjoy I don't know what it was, whether it was the books. It might have just been that I was getting very bad grades in comparison to my philosophy ones. Probably was that, to be fair. But I did not enjoy Mrs. Dalloway. And it's weird because I really enjoy The Waves and Orlando and To the Lighthouse. I think they're fantastic. But when I read this, I just didn't get on with it. I think probably what it was that I just wanted to get this book read so that I could do the essay, and the stupid stream of consciousness nonsense was just annoying, and Mrs. Dalloway was just annoying, and I just wasn't into it, and I just kind of a bit like Great Gatsby. I just wasn't really interested in that kind of 1920s socialite pouncing around meh. It just didn't do it for me back in school. And so yeah, I haven't read this one since, but you know, I have read Virginia Woolf's other works and enjoyed them, so I feel like I should go back to this at some point, and when I do, I'll definitely do a review on the channel, so you can see if I've changed my mind or if I hate it just as much as I used to. But yeah, did not enjoy this one in school, in uni when I read it. Next up we have the final Shakespeare on the list, I think, and that is Othello. Kind of just a great tale of jealousy. Iago is one of Shakespeare's best villains. He's kind of like Richard III in that he is very kind of just evil for the sake of it, although he seems to have a bit more of a good motivation in that he seems to be jealous of Othello and his successes, but he's still just, you know, one of those villains that revels in how bad he is, which is great. And yeah, I think it's a great play. The only thing that I think lets it down is that I do think Desdemona is a bit of a thin character. I always found her maid, I think she's called Emily the maid, I always found her to be a little bit better. But yeah, I still think I'd say it's great. It's not one of my favourite Shakespeare's, but it's certainly up there. Next up, Oscar Wilde is back, this time with a picture of Dorian Gray, and again, going straight up into my canon. Fantastic story, and it has that sort of fairy tale feel to it as well. You know, the story of someone who desires to be young forever and then makes this wish, and then his portrait ages instead of him. It does have that sort of fairy tale feel to it, which, like Oscar Wilde's fairy tales do. And I think he just does that really well, and I guess it's because he captures on this kind of universal sort of desire for youth thing, and I just think it's a great story of corruption. The only thing I would say against it is there is a part of it where just for ages and ages he goes on about like the fashions and trends of the time as Dorian's just kind of living this decadent life, and I just feel like that goes on for a little bit too long. But other than that, I think it's just a fantastic story. And next up we have the other book that's going to join Virginia Woolf down at the bottom, and that is Henry James's The Turn of the Screw. Unlike Mrs. Dalloway, which annoyed me, but at least it was memorable, you know, it's quite told in an interesting way, so at least you remember it. This book just put me to sleep, and to be honest, I only remember what the story is because of just kind of it being reasonably well known. The story of a governess, she goes somewhere, there's potentially a ghost of a boy at this house that she's working at, but also it could just be that she's horny and she's imagining it because she's repressed. And apparently that's an interpretation. I personally didn't see that when I read it, but that's probably because I was falling asleep most of the time, so I probably missed that one. But yeah, I did not enjoy this in university, and in fact, again, unlike Mrs. Dalloway, where I feel like there was something there, I just was incapable of appreciating it at the time. I don't know if there was with The Turn of the Screw. Maybe it's a cool story, and maybe that interpretation of kind of sexual oppression is really interesting, but I just found Henry James's prose style incredibly dry and bland, and it just didn't do it for me at all. But yeah, if you have read this book, let me know in the comments, because you know, I always like to, you know, understand why people can, you know, love the things that they love. So if you think this is a great book and you think I'm missing something, I'd definitely like to get your thoughts in the comments on it. But yeah, in university, that just wasn't for me. Next up we have another Gothic novel, but one that I enjoyed a lot more, and that is Zastrozzi, or The Moor, by Charlotte Dacre. This is actually a somewhat, I don't want to say rip-off, I think that's a bit mean, but it follows very closely the plot of an earlier Gothic novel, Matthew Gregory Lewis's The Monk. In both cases they tell the story of kind of corruption, but the big difference is that in Zastrozzi's case it's told from the perspective of a woman and it's her corruption, whereas in The Monk it's a male. And so you do actually get, you know, it's not just like as superficial as that. There are like deep differences between men and women that are explored in these two stories. So it's definitely worth reading both of them, and I definitely think that Charlotte Dacre is doing enough with the original story to make it you know, original and interesting in its own way. So I'm not writing it off on those grounds. And it's a fantastic book. I think I do prefer The Monk, personally, but I also think Zastrozzi is great. And if you've read The Monk, you should definitely read this just to see the differences. And what I like about Charlotte Dacre is that she just tells the story of this unapologetically evil woman. Unlike with The Monk, where I feel like there's a bit more of a sense of the fall from grace, it seems like the character in this, I can't remember what she's called now. We'll call her Emily. I don't think she's called Emily, but we'll call her Emily. She is basically unapologetically evil, I think, from the start. And it's quite fun. You just kind of revel in this really evil character for a while, and it's quite entertaining. And Dacre also writes in this very over-the-top way, in a very good way, not in a bad way at all. But yeah, if you imagine like Gothic overwrought prose, Charlotte Dacre is up there with that. So yeah, if you enjoy that kind of Gothic novel, then you'll definitely enjoy Zastrozzi, so you should read it. But yeah, I'm going to put it in great novel. I don't think it's quite canonical, but I do think it's pretty fabulous, so great it is. Last we have Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Again, another one that in school and I just didn't get on with as much as I get on with Dickens now. Now I would, if I reread this now, probably it would be great or in my canon. But back in school, I just didn't gel with it all that much. I enjoyed, we watched a film version of it, which I really enjoyed, and it was enough to motivate me to read it again, because I was like, this film is so good, so the book must be better, because that's true, right? It's always true. But I think I got about halfway through, and I really enjoy the early stuff. I love when Dickens writes about kids, because I think he just does it really well, especially in his later books with like David Copperfield and Great Expectations and Bleak House. But yeah, then we get to where he grows up and goes to London, and I remember falling asleep again. It was a bit like Henry James situation. But unlike Henry James, I think that Dickens just has a wonderful sense of humour, so he kind of pulls himself back from the brink. I think I'm going to say I get why it's a classic, because I do remember still enjoying that early part of the book quite a lot, even if I kind of flagged as we went along. But yeah, so I'm going to go with that for Great Expectations, and I'll probably change my mind when I read it again, which I definitely will, because I want to read all of Dickens' books at some point in my life. Alright, that's it for this list. Let me know down in the comments if you were forced to read any of these books in school. Did you enjoy them then? And if you dared reread them years later, did your views on them change over time? Look forward to discussing that with you in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all in the next video. Take care everyone. Ta-ra!